Hello, this is Claudia Filas with the Center for Hellenic Studies, and I'm so delighted to be joined here today by Professor Joseph Nagy, who is joining us today to talk about a wonderful topic. He's going to help us think about Irish epic and some sagas. In particular, we're going to think about a hero named Heather and other peculiarities of the Cavalry of Fraech. And so, Professor Nagy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Claudia.
And thanks to all our participants who are joining us. We had so much interest today that we are actually going to have two groups of people join us. So about halfway through, we're going to switch out. Okay, so some faces are going to join in, and some people will stay and hang out. But we're going to continue the conversation for an hour. So thank you again for joining us. Before we really get going, I want to share a little bit about your bio. So, Professor Nagy, you are currently the Henry L. Shattuck Professor of Irish Studies. You began teaching at Harvard in 2016. You received your BA in Folklore and Mythology in 1974, and your PhD in Celtic Languages and Literature in 1978, both from Harvard. And before coming to this institution, you were at the University of California in Los Angeles, affiliated with the Department of English, the Indo-European Studies program, and the Folklore and Mythology program. You are the author of many books and articles on medieval Irish literature and comparative mythology. In addition, you're the founder and first editor of the Celtic Studies of North America yearbook. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, my pleasure. Hi, everybody. I like the wood paneling behind me because it makes me look as if I'm in a sort of on the witness stand. And please think of me that way because it's always great to get questions. My field is, to some extent, famous, but also very obscure. So I expect no previous knowledge from anybody. And I love the way Claudia gave the title of this text, The Cavalry of Fraech, because the pronunciation of Irish names is oftentimes something of a problem, even for those of us who work in the field. How I got into this field, well, as you can tell perhaps from my surname, I am not the least. I am Gregory's smallest brother. I'm number 4 out of the 4. And Gregory really did teach me everything I know. He was very much like a father figure to all of us. And at one point he said to me, "Go north, young man." So he is a classicist, of course. The second brother is also a classicist, Blaise, who teaches at Holy Cross. The third went off in an artistic direction. But I was developing into an academic myself. But Gregory suggested I look at some Northern European traditions. So I found Irish, and I fell in love with the material. And I've been working on that ever since my college years. So it's great to share it. It's very much like preaching a gospel because, again, people might know a thing or two about Irish tradition, but there's so much left to talk about and so much information to impart. I thought the text I chose would be of interest to this group because, well, we can't really call it an epic, though we do have a character, I suppose we could call a hero, and we do have some situations that are arguably epic. It's usually safer to call these medieval Irish texts sagas, even though, of course, the term saga comes to us from Scandinavian, specifically from Icelandic tradition. But it's a good way of describing these relatively short or manageable prose narratives that feature heroic characters and also both heroic males and females, by the way. And that were composed for the most part in the late 1st millennium CE, or also in the early 2nd millennium CE. Composed, as far as we can tell, for the most part by Christian monks in Ireland. And that's something very important to remember, is that this literature and this body of story is coming to us via the medium of the Western church tradition, Christian tradition. It is remarkable that in Ireland there seemed to be much more receptivity to collecting stories from the past to stories that in many cases seem to reflect pre-Christian beliefs, pre-Christian traditions, pre-Christian morals even. Sometimes these texts come with a kind of tag attached to them of kids don't try this at home, or we realize this is the past and this is not the present. But there clearly is great affection for this body of story, and as a result, once the Irish figured out a way to write their own language down using the Latin alphabet, which they received via the church tradition, there was no stopping them. And there's an enormous amount of medieval Irish literature. That's one of the things that attracted me to this field, is that you feel like a kid let loose in a candy store because there is so much material to work on. And unlike, say, the study of classical Greek literature or the study of classical Latin literature, there are relatively few workers in the vineyard. There aren't that many of us. The department I work for here at Harvard is the only department of Celtic studies in the US, and there are only 3 of us on the faculty. So our faculty meetings are a hoot because, do we form into subcommittees and so forth? There is a Congress of Celtic Studies that meets every 4 years, and that does attract several hundred people. But this is not a large body of academics working over and over and over the same material. There's still a lot of pioneer work to be done, a lot of editing, a lot of translating, a lot of commentary and understanding to be done. So that's one of the reasons why it's so fun to be in this field, and also to introduce it to others. By the way, you'll notice that I said Celtic. Now, Irish is a subsection of Celtic, and Celtic is most safely used as a language term referring to a family of Celtic languages, which are a subfamily of the Indo-European languages. And since you are all, as I am, disciples of Greg, I'm sure you all know what Indo-European is. So Celtic is certainly not Greek, it's certainly not Latin, but it is part of the larger Indo-European family. And in many respects, it is fun to compare and contrast what's going on in Irish literature, also in Welsh literature, and Sarah, also in Scottish Gaelic literature, though that for the most part comes after the medieval period, to compare it with things that we find in other Indo-European traditions, such as ancient Greek epic or ancient Indic epic, or other traditions as well. So to get to this particular text that I shared with you, this is a text composed in the late first millennium CE, probably. The remarkable thing about it is that the story has survived down into the 20th century. And again, Sarah, I defer to you as our Scots representative here. It has actually been collected from singers of ballads in Scottish Gaelic in the second half of the 20th century. So it's a story with a remarkably long shelf life, though the story has gone through all kinds of changes, though we needn't talk about those right now. We can just focus on this, which is the earliest telling of the story that has survived, and it's from Ireland, and again, it's from possibly the 8th or maybe 9th century. The hero is a character called Fraech. When you see CH in Irish Gaelic or in Scottish Gaelic, it's pronounced ch, it's not pronounced ch. And the name Fraech is actually the Irish word, and I believe it's still, or it's the ancestor of the modern Scottish Gaelic word for heather. It also has the more abstract meaning of fury, anger, rage. And you might be wondering why that is. Well, you may have seen the heather plant blooming in the late spring and summer, and it's very, very beautiful. But I wonder if any of you have ever actually fallen into a clump of heather, because in fact it is a very prickly plant, and probably it's the prickliness of it that leads to the sense of the word for heather also being a word meaning anger or fury, and that makes it appropriate as a name for a warrior figure or a warrior hero, such as the main character in our story. The story is called A Cattle Raid, And raiding cattle might not sound too exciting to us unless we consider how, for example, the American genre of the Western so often deals with the whole issue of cattle rustling and of the importance of cattle. If we were to look at medieval Irish economy and society, we would see that there too we have cattle barons, and we have the notion of wealth being measured in terms of how large your herds are. This is a island, Ireland, that is divided into, some have estimated, up to 150 kingdoms around 800, 900 AD or CE. It's not that big an island. It's about the size of the state of Wisconsin. So some of these kingdoms were quite small, and kings were very much cheek by jowl with each other. And they oftentimes were very competitive with each other. And a great way to express your hostility towards or your superiority to your neighbor king was to steal some of his cattle, because chances are the king would probably have the largest herd of anybody within the kingdom. So cattle raiding was an actual historical activity, and stories about cattle raids are very popular in medieval Irish storytelling. The problem with this particular text, and this is one of the reasons why I love medieval Irish literature, because while you can explain it in this sort of rational academic way, so many things go on that are, well, downright crazy, is that in this particular text, you would think a story about Fraech's cattle raid would mean that he steals someone else's cattle, right? But in fact, what happens in the story, if you've read the text, is that it's his cattle that get stolen, and then he has to recover them. So in what way is this Fraech's cattle raid? This is one of those things you can agonize over, you can write articles, maybe even monographs about, and make yourself a name in the study of medieval Irish literature. Now, there is Fraech, and he is associated with the province of Connaught. As many of you, I'm sure, know, Ireland still today is divided into 4 provinces. You've got Ulster, and then going clockwise to the south of Ulster, you've got Leinster, and then you have Munster down in the southwest, and then you have Connaught up in the northwest. Fraech is not the only character in this story. He hears that a beautiful girl called Finnever, that's the name there under number 3, Finnever is in love with him, and he decides to go and woo her, as heroes are sometimes wont. You might be wondering how Finnever falls in love with a fellow that she's never met. Maybe she looked him up on his website, but this is actually a motif that we find in other literatures as well, the idea that someone is so heroic, is so impressive, that you fall in love with that person even though you've never met the person. So he decides to follow this through. You might notice, by the way, that Fraech is described at the beginning of the text as having a supernatural mother who comes from the sheath, and that's S-I, acute accent D. And this is an Irish word meaning supernatural dwelling, mound. Not Christian, clearly pre-Christian, but a conceit, a device, a given that you find in many, many medieval Irish texts, and also a belief that comes with a whole set of stories that you still find in modern Irish folklore. You will still find many people in Ireland, especially living in the countryside, who believe in the existence of these otherworldly dwellings, or she. It's the same in the singular and in the plural in pronunciation. If they're speaking English, they might refer to it as fairy mounds, and they might use the term fairy, even though I hate to use the word fairy to refer to these supernatural beings in Irish tradition, because number one, it's coming in from English influence. Of course, the word is actually a French word. Second, fairy to us connotes something light and airy and something from a Walt Disney movie. But in fact, the otherworldly beings of medieval Irish literature, and still today of Irish oral tradition, are quite substantial, oftentimes dangerous, and in many cases not that different from you or me. So again, fairy is a term we can use as shorthand, but we have to redefine it if we are going to use it. Anyway, Fraech falls in love, or thinks he might fall in love with and might be worth wooing, this Finnefer. Her own name is intriguing. It seems to mean something like bright supernatural being. So just as Fraech is coming from a supernatural background, maybe she is as well. For those of you with a wider literary perspective here, you might be amused to know that this Irish name Finnefer is cognate with, and again, I suspect having learned with Greg, you all know what that word means. It basically means cousin. It's a cousin to the Welsh word, or to the Welsh name Gwenhwyvar, or Gwenhwyvar, which is the name of Arthur's wife in Welsh tradition, and which then goes into French and becomes Guinevere, which, by the way, also then develops later into Jennifer. So if you know any Jennifers, they really are called Guinevere, and you might be deeply suspicious about their loyalty to their spouses. Anyway, so this Finnefer is said to be the daughter of Ailill and Medov, and again, we've got those names on the PowerPoint. Medov comes to be pronounced as Maeve, and in fact, this is a name that we still find today, usually in Ireland, but sometimes people have picked up on this name outside of Ireland and named their children Maeve. There was, for example, a famous Irish writer who died not long ago called Maeve Binchy, whose novels some of you might have read. It's a name that is fascinating in its meaning, and it's ambiguous because it can mean either the one who is intoxicated or the one who herself is intoxicating. And by the way, at the heart of this Irish name, Medov, later Maeve, is the same Indo-European element that gives us in English, for example, mead, M-E-A-D, which refers to a kind of fermented drink, which of course is intoxicating, and if you drink enough of it, you too become intoxicated. So it's a curious name for a person to have. And actually, Maeve doesn't do that much in this story, though as one of you pointed out, she does engage in this game of some sort of a board game that maybe is a cousin to chess, but which is oftentimes referred to in medieval Irish literature. She engages in this board game with her guest Fraech, and they become so engaged in the game that they forget about everything else and they keep on playing for days. And meanwhile, food is not being served to Fraech or to the other guests, and this becomes a point of embarrassment. Some have argued that this is humorous, but it's also very much part of the hyperbole of the larger-than-life feel and behavior of characters in medieval Irish storytelling. So it's both amusing, but it's also a sign of how these people are sort of like us, but they're also not like us. They are more epic. They are more heroic. They are they are supersized in many respects compared to us. Now, a character enters in the later part of the story, and this is where the visuals of the second page of the PowerPoint, let's not go there yet, but the visuals of the second page of the PowerPoint might come into play. Someone called Conall Cearnach, and he's associated with the province of Ulster. And Ulster and Connaught in medieval Irish storytelling don't really get along with each other. So it's actually quite remarkable what happens in that last part of the story, the way that Fraech and Conall Cearnach gang up together. They join forces to find Fraech's stolen cattle. And by the way, speaking of wonderful contradictions and mysteries in our text, and the sort of things that drive some people crazy, but I just love. You might notice, if you've looked at the text, that here we have our hero going off to woo Finnefer. He is said to be a bachelor. He woos her successfully, though it is not easy. And then he goes back home, presumably, well, he's basically now engaged to her, and he's going to go back and pick her up, or at least have sex with her within a year. But he comes back home, and his mom, whom we've already been introduced to at the beginning of the story, says to her boy when he comes home, "Bad news, Fraech, your cattle have been stolen along with your wife and kids." So, where did these wife and kids come from? And is this a matter of a clumsy scribe or clumsy composer putting together two different versions of the story? That's very often what people suggest. But I think there's method to the madness. I think that in fact this author is very much aware of what he's doing, because you might remember that the way that Fraech actually wins Finnever in the final episodes of his stay at the court of Ailill and Maeve is by lying. He lies about how he got his hands on the ring, which had been entrusted to Finnever by her father as a trap. He lies. And maybe I'm missing something, but in all my years of reading medieval Irish literature and encountering all kinds of medieval Irish heroes and situations of wooing and situations of conflict and so forth, I can't think of any other instance where a hero wins the day by lying. Not to be a Boy Scout here, and not that they were Boy Scouts, but it's just a very, very peculiar way for a hero to achieve his goal. Hence, I suspect that what we have here is the author reflecting upon that lie and showing that, in fact, there's more to Fraech than this bachelor, that, in fact, he already has a wife and children, or that just as Fraech lies, storytelling tradition lies. And there are these variant versions of the story of Fraech, in one of which he's a single guy, in another of which he's not a single guy, and he's off not just recovering his cattle, but also recovering his family. So again, I think there may be some subtext here that's going on. Any questions at this point before I continue, or comments? I'd love to hear what you're thinking. Yeah.
Yes, actually, I have a thought about that story with the salmon, because I live in Scotland, not far from Glasgow, and there is a story about the patron saint, St Mungo.
Yes.
And there's a very sort of similar situation where the King of Strathclyde accuses his wife of infidelity.
Yes.
And asks her to produce a ring, but he has actually thrown it into the Clyde. And then Mungo gets a salmon caught, opens up the salmon, and there's the ring. And it immediately struck me there's some similarities. There's some deception, not only on Fraech's part, but also on the king's part, isn't there? Because he's taken the ring and thrown it into the river and then asked for it to be produced.
Yes. Isn't Ailill nasty, by the way? I mean, he's such a... I'm the father of two nubile daughters, so I sympathize with Ailill. But it's really quite terrible what he does. Yes, thank you so much for that. And by the way, give my best to St. Mungo, and St. Mungo's Cathedral is one of my favorite places in the world. Yes, that has been suggested by some as a possible source for this motif in the cattle raid of Fraech. The problem is that story about St. Mungo and about the king and so forth, that's attested much later than our text. So chronologically speaking, you'd have to say that the witness to the St. Mungo story could conceivably show that the story in St. Mungo's life comes from the secular source, comes from the Fraech story. And for those of you, well, all of you here who are interested in classical literature, make a beeline when you can to Book 3 of Herodotus's Histories. Because in fact, already in Herodotus, we find more or less this story having to do with a tyrant on the island of Samos off Asia Minor by the name of Polycrates, Polycrates, who has an alliance with the Pharaoh of Egypt. And the Pharaoh of Egypt says to Polycrates, you know, I enjoy being your ally and being your friend, but things are going so well for you, I'm a little bit nervous about that, because in a life that seems to be so blessed, there's bound to be some big disaster that's coming down the pike. So why don't you avoid that by inducing your own disaster? And do this by intentionally losing the thing that means the most to you. And Peculiarities had this special ring, which he was very, very much attached to. And you can look up the theories of various scholars about what this ring signifies in Herodotus's world. But he takes this ring, he goes out on a boat with his men, and he throws the ring into the water. And so he loses it on purpose. And he thinks, there, that's the disaster that's occurred in my life, and now the Pharaoh can be relaxed and he can continue to be my ally, not worried that I'm going to end up being a failure and that he will end up in association with my failure. So he goes back home, and then a few days later, a fisherman comes by with this gorgeous fish that he presents to the king. And Peculiarities accepts it happily, and so they cook up the fish, and what do they find in the fish but the ring? And Peculiarities thinks this is great. He says, oh, this is wonderful. This is the gods showing me that I am impervious to misfortune, and that I get back everything that I value and that I have happened to have lost. And he writes about this to the Pharaoh of Egypt. But the Pharaoh of Egypt then writes back and says, oh boy, you're in even more trouble than I thought. So let's forget this alliance. I don't want you as my friend anymore. And indeed, later on, Peculiarities does meet a rather awkward and embarrassing end, which I will leave to you to discover if you don't know the story already. So this is what folklorists would call a narrative motif about losing something, and then you find it miraculously in fish's belly. By the way, if you want an interesting biblical example of that, go to Matthew 17, verse 27. There's a story there which clearly is inspired by the same motif. So again, Matthew 17, around verse 27. It's a great story, actually.
And first of all, I'm thinking too about the Theseus myth, right?
Yes, yes.
And that's tied into kind of marriage. But, I know we have limited time, and I do want to just invite our community members to ask one more question. I think Elizabeth has a question for you.
Yes, it struck me when you said that he's a liar, and it's sort of it's sort of unusual in that type of literature. What similarities does this character have to, say, Odysseus or other characters in Greek literature that were more commonly known as liars?
Very, very good point. And I think that in other respects also, Fraech is, I wouldn't necessarily say a new kind of hero, but he represents something that's maybe in the works, where you have a hero who achieves what he needs to achieve by way of lying, or by way of even non-martial accomplishments. You'll notice that, when he's in the pool and he has an encounter with the monster, he would have been a goner had it not been for Finnever, who jumps in and gives him the sword with which he can kill the monster in the pool. He's not a Beowulf who with his bare hands can handle a monstrous being. He needs that help, and he's actually helped by a girl, which in the medieval Irish context is, again, something quite unusual. And by the way, notice how Finnever there is not just proactive. And again, how terrible of Ailill that he throws this spear at his own daughter. How tacky. But it's also a scene where you get to see Finnever naked. And there's this, if you're thinking of this in cinematic terms, it's a very, very dramatic scene. And her own physical beauty then almost overshadows that of Fraech, who is also described as being quite a hunk and being quite pleasant to look at naked in the water. So there's a lot going on there, and there's even a certain kind of redefinition going on of sex roles and so forth in that particular episode. There are more instances of this in other texts in Irish and also in Welsh tradition, where you have heroes who are sort of like Odysseus, that they lie, and that they also are at least accused of being merchants. My favorite example of that, and this may surprise you, is a figure that you may not think of as Celtic, but that's where he comes from, the figure of Tristan, as in medieval European epics about Tristan and Isolde, and of course also in the very famous 19th century opera by Wagner, Tristan und Isolde, which was based on medieval sources. If you go back to those medieval sources, when Tristan goes to woo Isolde, who happens to be an Irish princess, and he, by the way, is sometimes said to be Welsh or sometimes said to be Northern British. In any case, it's a kind of weird medieval, let's bring Celts together kind of story. When he goes to woo Isolde in Ireland, he says to his men on the ship, you know, if we can't do this legitimately, well, first, let's pretend to be merchants. Let's not say who we are. Let's not say that we're representatives of the King of Cornwall. Let's just say we're merchants. And if they don't give us Isolde, we'll just kidnap her. And if you go back to Herodotus again, the beginning of Book 1, when Herodotus explains why there's this conflict between Europe and Asia, he says essentially it's because merchants started stealing people's wives or daughters on their merchant journeys from either east to west or from west to east. So this idea of the merchant as a wife stealer, and also of the merchant as someone who double crosses or who is involved in a love triangle and so forth, that has a long history to it. And you see that popping up in both medieval Irish and medieval Welsh tradition, including in the Tristan and Isolde story, which comes into European mainstream from Britain and specifically from Celtic sources. Could we go to page 2 of the handout? Just, I know that some people might be signing off, and
yeah, in fact, I'm just going to let everyone know that we have a second group of participants who are going to be joining us for the second half, and so I want to welcome them as they come in and thank our participants who joined the first half. So you'll see some new faces joining. So thanks, Professor Nagy. I know you want to turn to the second
PowerPoint, you know,
the second page of the PowerPoint. I'm wondering if another point we can talk about,
sure.
You know, the scene that you mentioned already, which is a scene where Fraech sort of goes into the lake, right?
Mm-hmm,
Is it a lake?
mm-hmm. Yes, yes.
And sort of the visuals around that, and what's so peculiar about that, right? Because one of the key terms in your title is this: what's peculiar about the story. So as a talking point to return to in a few moments, I'd love if we could get to that at some point, as well as the questions that our community members are going to share. But first, let's share this. The second page. You have some beautiful visuals for us.
Great. Well, visuals are always fun. I wish there were more from the actual manuscripts that contain the text, the cattle rate of Fraech and so forth, but typically vernacular manuscripts in Irish from medieval Ireland don't contain any illustrations, or the term for it is illuminations. But you do have lots of illuminations in manuscripts that contain Christian religious literature, such as the very famous Book of Kells. Kells is a monastery in Ireland with which this manuscript is associated, and it's a gospel book. So it has the 4 gospels in it. And especially some of the initial letters of the sections are very beautifully illustrated and expanded into images, oftentimes animal images. And this is an example on the left, that we have from the Book of Kells of what looks like a dragon. There are these images of snake-like, serpentine, monstrous creatures that we find in the Book of Kells. Maybe they give us one way to imagine this creature that Fraech encounters in that lake or in that pool. I'm calling it a pool because it seems to be more like a small lake, maybe a pond, perhaps with the rowan tree, aka a mountain ash tree with berries, which are in fact edible. So he meets this monster in the pool, and he has to cope with it. By the way, in later versions of the story, which I said can be found all the way down to the 20th century, in those later versions, guess what? Fraech does not survive this encounter with the monster in the pool, and his beloved does not jump in to try to save him. He does kill the monster, but he comes out and then he dies himself. So in these later versions of the story of Fraech, there's no cattle raid. There's no salmon containing the ring. There's none of that later stuff. It's just essentially, it ends with the pool episode. But the word used for the monster in that passage in this earliest version of the story of Fraech, which perhaps a monster we can imagine like this, is only the Irish borrowing from Latin bestia, beast. So it's a word that means some kind of monster, but very, very vague. So I wish I could tell you that, yes, the word dragon, which of course comes from Greek, is a word for which we find a cognate in Irish, and it's used all over the place. And then we can think of this confidently as a dragon, this monster in the pool, but we really don't know how to conceptualize it. Now, there is one scholar who argues that there is an actual Irish cognate to Greek drakon, which is the source of English dragon, to be found in another medieval Irish text about another hero who encounters a monster in the water. But it's not our text. And again, in our text, it's just this word from Latin meaning beast that is used to designate this monster. But some of you might even come across, I think it's available online. There was a book written by a famous Scottish folklorist by the name of J.F. Campbell in the second half of the 19th century, which he died before it was published, but it was put out under his name, and another scholar contributed to it mightily, called The Celtic Dragon Myth. And the premise of this book is that this episode in the pool in the cattle raid of Fraech is a dramatic example of the presence of dragons in medieval Irish storytelling. Well, not quite sure that we really are looking at a dragon here. Now, if we could go back to the second page of the PowerPoint, anyone notice that there's another beastie somewhere in the cattle raid of Fraech? So we've got the monster in the pool. You could almost think of that salmon as being another kind of potentially hostile beast. Salmon can be quite big. But is there anything else in the text that you may recall toward the end? So Fraech and Conall Cernach go off to rescue their cattle, oh yes, and Fraech's wife and children, who are being held by these rustlers off in the Alps. And you might be wondering about that. Is this like some Bollywood film where you go off into some exotic location for some dramatic scene, or is this just the story has the budget to take everybody off to Switzerland? It's possible that the word there, which we translate into English as Alps, is actually a misunderstanding of Alba, which is the Irish word for originally Britain and then more specifically Scotland. I mean, there are mountains in Scotland too, so if you still want to see a mountain setting for this, you're welcome to. But what's the problem? What's the problem in recovering the wife and kids and the cattle down in the Alps? Remember?
Does anyone remember? Want to say thank you?
So Fraech and Conall run into these pair of Irish women who are working for the rustlers. Maybe they're slaves, maybe they're captives. They're taking care of herds, and they warn our heroes about the fact that this fort, which is where the cattle and the wife and the kids are being held, is guarded by a nasty serpent. And the serpent is going to be even more of a problem than the rustlers themselves. So we're set up, and again, this is so typical of medieval Irish storytelling, we're set up for this big climactic battle where we finally get to see Fraech as a warrior and also have the chance to see a second hero, Conall Cernach, also doing his warrior thing. But in fact, what happens is as they approach the fort, the serpent sees Conall and leaps upon him and crawls into his belt or maybe into his wallet. The word can be translated both ways, and doesn't do anything. And so the fort is successfully attacked by our two heroes. The rustlers are not a problem. The wife, the children, the cattle are recovered. And oh yes, then the serpent leaves Conall Cernach's belt or waist. And the text says they didn't harm each other. So what an anticlimax.
Yeah, can I ask about that? I mean,
yeah.
The story that you just shared, I mean, in the translation that you suggest that we read, that was pretty much it. It was about 4 or 5 sentences.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's it. I mean, talk about micro-compression.
Yeah,
What's
right.
going on there?
Yeah, so gotta go.
Yeah.
Running out of space in the space allotted within the manuscript for the story, so we're just going to wrap this thing up. I would say that's what it is, except in fact, there are many instances of this in medieval Irish storytelling. And again, it's something that drives some readers crazy today, but some of us love it, is that it just is always playing with your expectations and very often defeating your expectation and leaving you thinking, what happened? And what am I supposed to make of this? Now, if we go back to that picture on the second page of the PowerPoint, this may be a clue. This may be a clue. What you see on the right is from a cauldron called the Gundestrup cauldron that was found in a bog in Denmark, a bog in an area called Gundestrup, that most scholars agree was probably made by Celts, the cauldron was. And it has these silver plates on it which have these fascinating images, which unfortunately don't come with subtitles. Now, here we're talking about continental Celts, and we've mentioned the Irish and we've mentioned the Welsh. Well, and I hope this isn't bad news, but in fact, were you to go back to Europe of Herodotus's time and traveled deep into the European heartland and traveled all the way from the Balkans to the Iberian Peninsula, most of the people you would meet would be speaking a Celtic language. So this is one of those fun historical facts about which those of us in tiny Celtic departments we can take some satisfaction from this, that yes, we may be small now. The Celts might be reduced to just a handful of nations and a handful of people speaking these languages. But back in the day, back in the good old days, and I know all of us as people interested in the classics think of it as the good old days, back in the middle of the first millennium BCE, Europe was dominated by the Celts and dominated by these people speaking various Celtic languages, who in many cases have left these beautiful artifacts and who ultimately are conquered by the Romans, but who nevertheless in many ways carry on their Celtic languages, their Celtic art styles, even their Celtic social institutions. My favorite example of this is the word in English for a piece, as in a piece of pizza, P-I-E-C-E. That comes from French, pièce, and probably it comes into French, which is primarily a Romance, that is a Latin-based language, but it comes into French from the earlier Celtic language spoken in France, and it's a word that you still find in Welsh as peth, P-E-T-H, meaning a thing or a piece or part of a larger whole. So there still are traces of the Celts to be found in continental Europe, not just in the languages, but also in the place names. Most major river names on the continent of Europe, especially in Western Europe, are originally Celtic names. So this is just by way of background to the Gundestrup cauldron. And one of the panels features this guy. And yes, those of you who practice yoga might be intrigued by how he's seemingly in a yoga position. Let's not forget that there's much to yoga that's also very Indo-European. He's got antlers. And he's there with a deer with antlers. And on his right side, he seems to have, well, a pig or a boar, and maybe some kind of lion-like figure above the boar. And what is he holding? Well, in his hand on our left, he's holding a torque. And the torque, which goes around the neck, is a very common Celtic status symbol already in the ancient Celtic world and still in medieval Irish and Welsh tradition. And what is he holding in his other hand? Well, sometimes I like to think it's a microphone with a cord, but it's a snake. So he's holding the snake, and the snake seems to be fine with his holding it, doesn't seem to be objecting to it at all. Now, we go back to the name of that Irish hero accompanying Fraech, who, like Dr. Dolittle, can get along with animals, specifically the snake. And by the way, the word for snake there in the Irish text is nather, which is cognate with English nadder, which then, because the N is confused with the final N of the indefinite article an, as an an adder or an nadder, becomes adder, A-D-D-E-R. So it's just a word for snake that's used there in the Irish text. The Irish hero who has no problems with the snake, his name is Conall Cearnach. Conall is a very common Irish personal name. It just means something like puppy or young dog. It's great to be called a dog in Irish tradition. In other traditions, to be called a dog, of course, is a great insult. But in Irish tradition, they like dogs, and dogs are symbolic of martial valor. But the second element, this epithet or this nickname, Cearnach, what is that? Cairn seems to mean horned. And it's in fact cognate. The first element, the cairn, is cognate with English corn, or horn, I'm sorry, as in H-O-R-N, and also with Latin cornu, C-O-R-N-U, which means horn. So maybe his name means horned Conall. And maybe the reason why he gets along with the snake is because he's a distant Irish cousin of this continental Celtic fellow who has antlers growing, horns growing out of his head, and who seemingly can get along with snakes. Now, that is speculation, but unfortunately, when it comes to trying to align Celtic visual and archaeological evidence with the literary evidence, it's oftentimes a matter of speculation. And I don't think I would necessarily go into print with that, though some people have. But with you, I'm more than happy to share this speculation and to ask what you think, or also to ask if you have any other questions about this text.
Thank you so much, Professor Nagy. That was so beautiful. I just want to let everyone know we need to sign off about 5 minutes early. So this is a great time to take some questions. So please, I hope everyone can share a question or a comment quickly, perhaps.
I'm glad it's all straightforward.
No, they're being shy. They're going to ask a question.
If anyone would like to have more information about medieval Irish and also medieval Welsh story, there is a wonderful book with the very simple title of Celtic Heritage, which was written by a pair of Welsh brothers by the name of Rhys, R-E-E-S, Rhys. And it's still in print. And it's just a wonderful survey of Celtic storytelling with some, I think, very helpful preliminary attempts at interpretation and trying to understand within a cultural and a religious context. Highly recommend it.
I'm sorry. We need to talk about you. I think Olga had a quick question. I wonder if you could talk briefly. She's interested in hearing about the sort of...
Yes, about the Celtic language. Did it have a writing?
Well,
the language itself?
No. There is a form of writing in Irish known as Ogam, O-G-A-M, which predates the coming of Christianity, but which seems to have been based on the Latin alphabet as it came to be known to the Irish from the Romans, who were indeed over in Britain. Of course, the Romans never made it to Ireland, or if they did, only as people interested in trade. But the Romans did conquer Britain, and of course there were Celts in Britain, and there was considerable contact between Ireland and Britain. We do have this Irish form of writing which developed, but really it was not used for literary purposes. It was just used for the purpose of inscriptions. When, however, Christianity takes hold in Ireland in the 5th and 6th centuries CE, the Irish come up with this great idea to come up with a written form of their own language. And they use the Latin alphabet, which sort of works, but in other respects doesn't work. And they develop this written form of their own language. So that's one of the reasons why we have so much medieval Irish literature, is because they got into the business of writing down their stories in their own language quite early on. The Welsh similarly. And by the way, there's also a wealth of Welsh storytelling tradition from the Middle Ages, which many people consider to be just as interesting as the Irish, though there isn't quite as much of it. But it shows many of the same characteristics. And the Welsh also came up with a written form using the Latin alphabet of their own language.
Thank you. I see Tim may have a question.
Hi, actually, I have two. I know we're short on time, so I'll be fast. One, there's a lot of numbers in the early part of the text.
Yeah, I saw that, yes.
Yeah, I'm totally ignorant. I'm wondering if there's anything special about those numbers, because often things, sevens and nines and other cultures turn out to be important. And then just a quick comment about, is there anything special about the fight being in the water? I'm thinking about the famous cattle raid where we have the fight between the hero, whose name I'm sorry, I can't pronounce.
Cuchulainn, yes.
Thank you. And his best buddy, and that's in the water.
Yes.
And I'm thinking that was probably, rivers being borders,
right?
Or is there something about water and combat?
Right. First is to the numbers. This is a question one is often faced with. Yes, numbers do have significance in Irish tradition. 3 and multiples of 3 are very, very popular. But of course, 7 is also popular because of 7 days of the week, a tradition that via Christianity did come to be a part of Irish life as well. But I think oftentimes it's also a kind of verbal juggling act, that you're indicating that these figures, these numbers, that you can quantify as well as qualify and so forth. And some have argued that what we see in medieval Irish literature is like a snapshot of something which is actually more like a performance, where you would have to say you had to be there. And the cavalcade of numbers, the descriptions and so forth might get a little bit wearing as just a text you're reading. But if you had been there for the storyteller to work the storyteller's magic, it all would have been much more entertaining and even enlightening about what's going on. As for the fight in the water, right? This is a tradition to be found in Celtic of fights in fords. So you don't want to fight in water that's too deep, so you want to fight in water that is shallow. And of course, fords are also where you can cross over boundaries, and you're right that rivers and bodies of water very often were those boundaries among those 150 kingdoms in medieval Ireland, which fortunately is blessed with lots of streams and rivers and lakes. So yes, it is very much of a boundary kind of situation to fight. As for in this case, I think that pool is sort of like a boundary, but it's also a boundary between more abstract things such as failure and success, or being accepted into the family, so to speak, by Isla Maeve and not being accepted in, or childhood when you are not married versus adulthood when you are married. According to the culture of the time. So yes, water oftentimes is a transitional space, and once you pass through the water, you're a different person from the one who entered the water in the first place.
Right, yes, that
much,
makes sense.
Professor Nagy.
Thank you.
Sure.
I do see the time. I want to be cognizant of the fact that we need to finish off 5 minutes early today. So I want to thank all our participants who joined us today. I wish we could have gotten in more questions, but I wonder if we could follow up by questions with you, Professor Nagy, over the next few days to come, because I know people have, they're so interested in what we've been reading here. There's so much more for us to learn. And we really appreciate your guidance in terms of getting us starting and thinking about early Irish myths and sagas. So thank you so much.
My pleasure, and thank you so much for your observations and questions. I enjoyed them very much.
Okay, guys, thank you so much, and I hope, so we're going to sign off for this semester. Our open house discussion series will continue in January, so we'll look forward to a whole new schedule of scholars and artists and specialists who will join us to help us think about new topics and new questions. As always, I want to thank our community members who are so devoted, who join us today from all over the world. They're taking time out of their day to share their thoughts and questions and to make our community really a community and not just a place where we watch videos. So I really appreciate everyone's time. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great day.